Now, the art of a good pre-employment test is to find something that everybody understands, a mechanism that is easy to implement because we've used it many times before. So one test that I like to do is to get people to create things like objects that exist in the real world, like video recorders. Although a video recorder example is old hat, but the desk calculator still exists. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly flip through how I would do this pre-employment test, creating a simple desk calculator using JavaScript. For the front-end developers, JavaScript is now one of the must-have skills. And the desk calculator exercise would probably test the intermediate developer's skill in thinking through a problem. So I'm going to do a basic, not a scientific or a reverse Polish notation, just a straight up desk calculator. And of course, browser, checking to see that that browser's picking up all of the objects. So 3 objects, 1 CSS file, 1 HTML file, and 1 JavaScript file. Now, each of those is necessary. We could preload everything in one file, which is what we've seen a few times. Using Emmet here with Visual Studio Code, it's a pretty cool little auto completion. Hit tab after some code that you may have typed in. It's still not smart enough to understand how to deal with double quotes and div/div, but nonetheless. So what I'm doing is I'm building out the HTML in a 4x4 grid, so that each one of the buttons has an individual function. Going to write maybe 4 functions here, 3 or 4 functions. Obviously, there'll be one JavaScript function for each one of the numbers. So there'll be 10 physical number buttons, but one function taking a single parameter, a single integer parameter. Just getting my indentation right. It's always best to get your indentation correct. Again, I'm a Nazi about indentation, so anyone who would hand me a pre-employment test that hasn't been correctly indented probably will be viewed pretty dimly. So here's what it looks like, 0 styling, although I have put a standard catch-all styling so that I can see the border of every single element that I've produced, and making sure that that calculator has its 4 rows and its 4 columns, but I've yet to style each one. I've classed them but haven't styled them. I'll set IDs on the things that need to change as a result of the button presses, specifically the screen. But at this stage, I'm just going to do a very quick and dirty layout so that we can see each one of the buttons. Each one of the buttons is square, and each one of the buttons will show some visual feedback when the individual presses down on the mouse. So there's a mouse down or an active pseudo class that I will apply to this particular element, or the button element specifically. So just defining width and height. Width and height's probably a bad thing to use, but we know that the content within is only going to contain one single piece of text. Min height is probably a better mechanism for defining content. Note that the content is left justified in the top left hand corner, and I'm not going to do anything tricky. I'd just add some padding to try and bring down the content. So now I have, when I mouse down on things, we get a bit of visual feedback. Right, just fixing up some of the problems associated with standard layouts. Change my box sizing. So when I set box sizing border box, that just means that border doesn't play any extra or add any extra measurement to the overall size of things. I'm double thinking myself. I might not use row in the future, but I definitely need a screen, and that screen is going to show the text as people press buttons. So as a pre-employment test, this is not primarily a design exercise. It's more a coding exercise. More interested in people's skills as in creating interactivity. Design can be outsourced at a much cheaper hourly rate than does programming. So what we're trying to identify here, I suppose, would be the skills of the developer, not the skills of the designer. Or I'm just trying to make some excuses for bad design here, but nonetheless, I tend to design at least with all my borders switched on, so that I can see how each element is going to define its size characteristics, including body. So BODY is there, and that's the thing that's going in for the entire width of the screen. Yeah, I'm just fiddling with the screen a little bit, trying to get it right, but I'll give up on that. That spans are problematic from the get-go. Inline elements can't really have their height and width defined in a meaningful way, and therefore things like float and text align, unless they're in a decent sized container, aren't going to do much. So I'm going to take some shortcuts with the JavaScript side of things, and not add event listeners in the one place that they should be, and that is in the window onload function. I'll put them just in the HTML direct. My adage with the coding generally is to attempt to implement the simple, and then progressively create the complex. So I'm going to add on-clicked events directly in the HTML, and eventually we'll take them out. But the difficulty, of course, then I have to ID each button, and that becomes a little bit more difficult. So in the short, sort of most direct method, I'm going to create the same function called the addNum function, which takes one parameter, a single integer, which is why I'm not putting it inside double quotes or single quotes for that matter. But for every button press, we have to make sure that the correct value is sent through. And those on-click events are creating /divs, which for some reason is destroying my design. So I'll get rid of the divs. Control Shift, I think, gives you multiple cursors. A handy mechanism if you've got to edit, multiple things, multiple adjacent things. I'm not sure that's an Emmet thing, but maybe a Visual Studio Code thing. But I mean, Visual Studio Code is putting the /div in, which is, not warranted in this particular case. So you can see I've added addNum, and when I test it out, I'm getting an error in my console telling me that you haven't created the necessary function for which you're trying to call. So we'll put that function in now, and I'll simply define that function as receiving a numerical value in its single parameter area, and then echo that straight to the screen. So I've defined screen as an ID, and I'm going to make that ID screen, and then say inner HTML equals whatever was pressed by the button, which isn't strictly how a calculator works, but nonetheless it proves out that we're not getting an error in our environment, and yes, numbers are appearing in our screen. The next is to sort of take that function a little bit further by defining globals. So the calculator is going to need a numerator and an operator. So we're going to have two numbers, one that is typed in one by one and then is shuffled back to num2 to provide the calculus. So for every number that's pressed, we multiply by 10 and then take that button value. So we end up with numbers accumulating. And because I've put that in the table structure, it's starting to look a little bit ugly. We won't worry about reducing the physical size of the integer, but what we will do is we won't accept this stretching out or tableization of content. We'll take the physical screen out of the table structure, so it won't be a part of, it won't be a row, it won't be a cell. In fact, it'll probably come out of calc as well. We'll take it completely out of the interface, so that it doesn't create table-like disturbances when we start creating things that are too big. Indentation, have to make sure indentation is good. Going back to the styling, can't let go of styling. What I need to do, I think, is now that it's out of the table structure, I don't need any of that. And I should be able to use text align now, and she goes to the right. So it's a bit more screen-like. Content is coming from the right as if it is a real calculator. So I'm happy with that particular layout. But of course, it's not a calculator. It's not functioning as a calculator. What we need to do is we need some new functions that are going to define one of the 4 operators that are allowed, and that is multiply, divide, plus and minus. So what I'm going to do is write another function in JavaScript that tells the system what button the user pressed, and another global will need to be stored so that we remember that the user typed a plus or a minus. So we'll put that function in, and that function takes a parameter, which will be the operator, and what we need to do is to store another global on the outside so that other functions will see that. See, the final calculation, calcnum, that third function, is going to need to know what operate num function received in terms of plus minus. So if we have a look at the globals that are here, we probably need 4 globals, but we'll deal with the third one now, which is opnum. And opnum is simply going to store whatever the user typed. So we're just going to say opnum equals what was passed into it. And then move num1 into the num2 slot, and then set num1 to 0 so that we can start typing anew. So a new number will appear that will calculate num1 and num2 together. So now that we want to calculate, what we need to do is to ask 4 questions. And the 4 questions essentially come down to, are you adding, multiplying, dividing, or taking away? So each one of those possibilities is going to result in a slightly different calculation, and then be returned to the screen called outnum. Now that outnum is not a global. It's local to the function and will appear on the screen. Outnum will probably have to be num1 at some point, so that if a user adds and adds and adds 4 or 5 numbers together, at least outnum, which is the calculated initial value, remains on the screen. So functionally speaking, we have 3 globals and 3 functions, and those 3 globals and 3 functions need to culminate in producing an output. We reset those global variables back to 0 once the calculation is complete, but I'm not entirely happy with that either. The onload function's probably not going to be used here, because each one of the piece of JavaScript functions is going to be called when a user interacts with the interface. We would put all our event handlers in that onload function. So something's not quite right. And we're just looking through the possibilities. What I've done is I've used num2 as if it was num1. So adding works fine, but as soon as I want to add another number, things get a little bit weird. Now, there may be another feature. So I've added a button here called the decimal point, which requires another function to switch on decimals. So when a scenario occurs where I want to type, 11.27, I'm going to need to turn on the decimal mode, and I think decimal mode won't be a boolean. It'll probably be a value of some sort. But if a user hits decimal, then obviously every number that's pressed from there on in is going to change its characteristics. So the button press is going to need to do something different depending on what side of the decimal point it's on. I'm just dealing with the big if statement that makes button press know what side of the decimal we're operating in. And you can see num1 equals num1 plus button press, and then we'll divide by some kind of an operator, and that particular value will increment by 10, just like we'd multiplied by 10, but we're going to increment 10 and divide that out. And whatever the result is on either side of that if statement, we're going to print it to the screen, so the user will actually see on the screen what was done. I don't think things will work quite perfectly. But makeDes is going to turn on that operator. And the sharp-eyed individuals amongst you are going to see the bug that I've introduced for myself, because if makeDesc is 0, what's 0 times 10? It's still going to be 0. So it's going to take me a while to debug this, because I'm not great at maths. Yeah, you can see there we're able to divide and produce decimal numbers. So remainders still exist there, but the epiphany comes down to, well, what's going on here? We never get into decimal mode. Decimal mode never occurs. And I've console logged this because I don't trust what inner HTML is doing. What I really need to do is put another if statement in the makeDes function that says, look, if it's 0, then make it 10. And if it's 10, make it 100. And if it's 100, make it 1,000. If it's 1,000, make it 10,000, etc., etc. And then I divide my numbers by those values. And what happens? I get my my ever-increasing values beyond that decimal point. I'm confirming here that my browser's picked up the latest version. And the network part of the DevTools is particularly valuable for just identifying that we're working with what we think we're working with. So look, if makeDesc is 0, then makeDesc 10. And then what we can do is multiply whatever plus 0. So if it's larger than 0, we can multiply it out. If it's not, then make it 10. And that results in us producing something that's a little bit better. And we're just checking that we're getting things that we want. There looks like there's some more bugs being manifested. But at this point, if I receive something of this quality or this ilk, suffice to say the developer would actually go to interview stage. They've proven out their mettle. But there may be a couple of little confusing pieces that are occurring that a developer who goes the extra mile would likely to get a different set of questions or a different set of interview experiences. So what I'm doing is I'm going to the proper desk calculator, the one that's built into the operating system, just to confirm that my logic, the actual functions that I've written here, are more or less correct. And have produced an outcome that I'm looking for. And what I'm doing is just having a look through my logic, double checking my logic to make sure that I'm not missing something. And ultimately what's happened is that the actual incrementing of the decimal point needs to happen when the button press occurs, not when the decimal button is pressed. So each subsequent number needs to have that decimal incremented. So I came to that logic before and seems to have produced something that's a bit better. And that's the calculator done. I hope that was helpful for you and that you got something out of this video. Please subscribe and like and all the rest.